I know some people probably wanted an update on Truman as far as how he's doing. I didn't really know until last couple of days, but he's been doing a lot better. He's walking better. He's still somewhat feeble, but I told Cecilia earlier, he's looked the best that he has since October, in my opinion, at least. So he should be coming home by the end of the week, hopefully. So be praying about that transition goes easy. But I'm glad all of you are here tonight. I mentioned last week that we were going to be taking a little bit of a break from preaching through books, because most of the time when I do preaching, I go through. An interesting thing to start tonight would be the parables, because as far as I'm aware, the 4 years that I've been here, I've never done a series on the parables. I've done a few isolated lessons on them, but we've never looked at them kind of as a unit, and so that'll be what we're starting tonight. If you want to know how many parables there are in the New Testament, that depends on the definition of the word parable, because the number can be anywhere, just based on what I've seen, anywhere from 30 to 60 parables. They make up about a third of Jesus' teachings. You remember they were one of Jesus' favorite ways to teach. And he used them because he made men see using pictures in real life settings. He didn't just teach an abstract concept. He made it apply to people's everyday life. And obviously that's why they were so effective, and they're still effective even to this day. And preachers need to be aware of that, because, well, it's one thing to just explain a passage in its context and break down all the words and things, but you have to make people see how it applies to their life as well. And Jesus obviously considered that when he spoke in parables. Because some people, when they would hear Jesus give his parables, some would hear it and they would think, well, that's a cute story. Others would hear it and they would wonder, I wonder if there's something deeper to the meaning there. And obviously there was something deeper to the meaning. But what I want to talk about tonight, as far as kind of introducing the parables, is approach it from about 3 different areas. We'll ask the question, what is a parable? We'll talk about how Jesus used parables. And then we'll talk some about how to interpret parables. And so that'll be sort of our introduction to the parables tonight. What is a parable? The word in the original language, and you're probably aware of this, the word literally means laying alongside of or laying beside of. When you think about that root word para, we have words that use the word para in them, don't we? What's a parallel line? Some of you have notebook paper. On that notebook paper, you have parallel lines on it. That's 2 or more lines going in the same direction in the same length as each other. They're spaced alongside one another. We have an occupation called a paramedic. What do? Well, they relieve people in emergencies, right? Do paramedics work alongside anyone else in the field of medicine? They work alongside doctors, don't they, Teresa? Because, well, medic, and I didn't know this until I was putting together this lesson, medic means physician, and para, as I said, means beside of. So when you talk about someone being a paramedic, you mean they're working beside a physician, and so you have paramedic. Maybe we talk about athletes. We talk about athletes being unparalleled. When you say someone's unparalleled, what do you mean? He's unparalleled in the field of basketball or football or whatever it is. You're meaning there's been no one like him in the history of that game, pretty much, aren't you? You might think about Michael Jordan in the NBA. I guess you could make an argument for LeBron James now, but that's another discussion to get into. but unparalleled. No one could really match his statistics apart from just a very few select people as far as how he played the game. So when you think about something being parallel, you know that means being beside something. You say, well, what does that have to do with parables? Well, parables, as I said, mean a laying alongside of. Is this true or is this false? You can place one thing beside another to compare the two. Say if you have two different bottles of medicine, you look at the ingredients on the back of those bottles of medicine, can you compare what's in both of them? I did that the other night. I'm not sick for the record, but I stocked up just in case I was getting sick because, well, there's a lot of stuff going around this time of year, but there's two liquid medicines that people always take when they're sick in my experience. Do you know what they are? NyQuil's one of them. Theraflu. Do you know what the difference is between NyQuil and Theraflu? I didn't really know before I did this, but there's not much of any difference. They have the same ingredients, but Theraflu just has a stronger dosage of them. So take that information and file it away as you will. But I laid them alongside each other. I wanted to see how they were similar and how they were different, and they were more similar than I thought they were. You ever do that with grocery shopping? Do you ever compare how the name brand is price-wise to something Great Value or Clover Valley or wherever you do your shopping? Well, you kind of lay them alongside each other in a manner of speaking, don't you? To use an example from my own life, how much do you favor your mom and dad as far as looks? If you've seen a picture of my dad, well, let me say it this way. If you've seen me, you've seen a picture of my dad. Because we could pass for twins if we were the same age, but if you laid a picture alongside a picture of me, they'd be the same almost. But a parable, going by that type of thinking, is a comparison. It's an analogy. Don't know if you're a fan of Mexican food. I am. Those of you that know me know I'm a huge fan of Mexican food. We've got a good range of options as far as restaurants in town are concerned. And truth be told, they're all about the same except for a few things. Salsa is one of them. They seem like they can all be kind of hit or miss on their salsa. But not much difference as far as anything else that goes. Parables, and you've probably heard them described this way, parables are usually described as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's a good expression, but as a definition, that's probably too broad for what we mean as parables, because some things that Jesus said are called a parable by some, but aren't called a parable by others. And that kind of goes back into what I was talking about a moment ago, that there's some ambiguity as far as what makes a parable. Some people think that what he said in Luke chapter 4, verse 23 constitutes a parable. But notice what it says in Luke 4:23. He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself.'" Is there a difference between a proverb and a parable? A proverb is just a short, concise saying, basically, but a parable is usually longer than that. So Luke 4:23 wouldn't really qualify as a parable. That would be more of a proverb. Some think what he said in Mark chapter 7, verses 15 through 17 constitutes a parable. In Mark 7:15 through 17, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. Now the text does say that's a parable there, but the word parable in that context means basically just an obscure and difficult saying. They weren't really sure what he meant by that, and so it's called a parable there. Do you think his disciples were that familiar with that instance there? Probably not. But they would have been familiar with things that he said, like a sower went forth to sow. That was one of the parables, right? The parable of the sower. Well, they would have known all about that in Palestine. They probably would have been familiar with things like weddings and wedding feasts and wedding customs. And again, when you think about the parables, there were a few different parables that dealt with wedding-related topics. They would have been familiar with things like mustard trees. Didn't Jesus talk about a mustard seed that would grow? And again, that's really what makes a parable a parable. And as I said, it's somewhat of a loose term, and it may just mean a figurative saying, but almost every parable that Jesus spoke assumes a story, and you're familiar with that. And we'll notice those some more in the coming weeks. But that's what we could define as a parable. But number two, how did Jesus use them? Have you ever noticed that the main place you go to for parables are in the gospel accounts? Specifically Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's the main place you go to because everywhere else in the New Testament, here's what Nathan said to David, and you're probably familiar with this. 2 Samuel chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. The Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him." And you notice what David's reaction was when Nathan told him this parable. The ESV says David's anger was kindled against that man, and said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." What was David's initial reaction when he heard that story from Nathan? Anger. He wanted vengeance to be had, right? But what did Nathan say to David next? You're the man that's represented in this parable. It's you. How much had God blessed David's life up to this point? Well, up until the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, he blessed it in every conceivable way, didn't he? David stood before Goliath and defeated him. He spared his life a number of times when Saul wanted to kill him. We could go on, but that well-off man in that parable that Nathan described, that well-off man was David. And what did that well-off man do in that parable? He took from the poor man, right? And you can see, I think, how similar that is to the parables that Jesus used. They look almost identical to the format when you look at his. Because this parable that Nathan told David dealt with earthly affairs. Every parable that Jesus spoke could have happened. They drew a parallel between earthly things and heavenly things. One thing that Jesus did often, and we'll notice this some more in the coming weeks, he would start a lot of his parables and he would ask the question, "What do you think?" about thus and so. Sometimes he would end the parable by maybe asking his listeners what they thought the verdict of the story was. And it's pretty obvious why he did that, because did the parables have a deeper meaning than just a story? Well, he wanted his listeners to hone in on that as well. And one reason he did that was to make his listeners curious about what he was saying. And Jesus knew how important it was to hook them and have them hold on until the end, then make them see the application from it. And then once he got to the end of the parable, he would show them action had to be done. Isn't that what happened with David? Because Nathan came to David, he tells him this parable, and then did David understand that action had to be done by the end of that parable being told? Did David understand that he needed to make things right with God? Well, he did. And David wrote the 51st Psalm sometime after that. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your steadfast love. And that's a brief summary of how Jesus used parables. But number 3, how do we interpret them? Parables don't have really any strict rules of interpretation, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean with that. Some things in life have strict interpretation, don't they? Does math have strict rules of interpretation? 2 + 2 = 4. I'm not the greatest at math, but I remember that. Music sometimes has strict rules of interpretation. If you see a dot with a stem on it, that's a quarter note. If you see a dot with a stem and a flag, that's an eighth note. Parables aren't always subject to strict interpretation because it depends on the parable in question. Some things vary from parable to parable. If you think about the parable of the sower for a minute, you have things like the bird and the sun in that parable, right? Because the sun's scorching down on the seed when it's scattered on the ground. You have the birds coming down and picking at the seed. What about the prodigal son? You have the fatted calf. You have dancing and laughter, right? But how much does the fatted calf in the ring, does the fatted calf in the ring really represent anything in the story of the prodigal son? We don't really know. What does the swine stand for in the story of the prodigal son? We don't really know. What does the ring stand for in that story? Don't really know. But here's why I ask those questions about parables. Obviously, parables, all the parables have a meaning because Jesus made that plain. But if we analyze every single detail of every parable, we're liable to go into analysis paralysis about all of them. Because, well, if we go back to the prodigal son, who does the father in the prodigal son story represent? Who's standing and watching and waiting, ready for us to come home? God. Who does the prodigal son represent? Me. We understand that pretty easily. But what does the ring represent? Well, who cares? Do you see how we can get so bogged down on the minimal things and miss the deeper meaning? If we're going to interpret parables properly, we need to understand that not every single detail of a parable is meaningful. We need to understand the difference between a parable and an allegory. And I don't want to dive too deeply down this rabbit hole, but there is something called an allegory, and it comes up in the Bible in a few places. But you know how a parable where every single little detail doesn't matter? In an allegory, those things do matter. Everything represents something in allegory. But the main takeaway is that allegories are stories where every detail matters. Parables aren't necessarily that way. And this was something that was misunderstood for a long time, by the way, because, well, in the centuries after Jesus died, obviously people would have been familiar with his parables, but they treated his parables like allegories. And they would ask some of those same questions that I just asked you. Well, what does the ring in the prodigal son story represent? What does the fatted calf represent? One of them was told that about the Good Samaritan. There was this story about the Good Samaritan centuries ago where people thought that the Good Samaritan represents Jesus himself. The animal that he's placed upon represents the body of Jesus. The inn represents the church. Goes on and on and on. But you understand that's too much analyzation, right? As far as parables are concerned. But that's the way that people viewed them for the longest time. I want to give a few basic guidelines for how to interpret parables, and then this lesson will be yours. Number one, what's the main lesson of the story? Because the main lesson of the prodigal son story is obvious to me. God's watching and waiting and praying that we come home to him and get back into a right relationship with him. The parables in Matthew 25, when you read through them, are pretty obvious what they mean. All the parables in Matthew 25 talk about the second coming. You have the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, right? Some were ready and prepared, some were unprepared to meet the bridegroom when he came. In the same chapter in Matthew 25, you have the parable of the talents. The meaning behind that is, even though we need to be ready, we need to be doing something with our talents in the meantime while we're watching and waiting. Both of those parables teach basically the same lesson, that Jesus' return is imminent, which it very well could be. What's the main lesson of the story? Number two, if we're going to interpret them properly, we need to understand the parable in the context of it. Why is Jesus bringing up this parable in the passage where you're reading it? Why is he discussing this particular thing at this particular point in time? Well, when you think about the rich fool, the passage tells us that in Luke 12. You remember there were two brothers that were disputing over who would get the inheritance. You remember what Jesus said? Take heed and be on your guard against covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And what did the parable that he gave deal with? The man who thought his possessions were his everything. If it was something that Jesus devoted so much time to teaching, obviously it's something we ought to invest a lot of time in learning. One of the parables that Jesus gave, as I said, was that parable of the wedding feast, and I guess it was just kind of fate that our invitation song is "Come to the Feast," but our invitation song is "Come to the Feast." You know, that hymn is based off of that parable. Come, for the table now is spread, ye famishing, ye weary, come, and thou shalt be richly fed. Jesus gave that parable in Luke 14, and he was talking to the quote-unquote religious people, the Pharisees, some Jews that had the idea that basically since they were Jews, that meant they would be automatically accepted into the Messiah's kingdom, separate and apart from a change in character. If you notice in that parable in Luke 14, they all began to make excuses about why they couldn't come to the feast. One of them said that I bought a field and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. I bought 5 yoke of oxen. I must go out and examine them. Please have me excused. They were all worthy causes and valid reasons in most instances. But were they good enough to excuse turning down this invitation? No. Because how noble or important of a task does it have to be to justify not following after God? That's the most noble and important task we could ever undertake. Whether we become a Christian or not, whether we're not in a right relationship or not, I just know whatever excuse we muster, it's not good enough. Maybe you thought, I don't know enough to begin. How do I get started? What do I need to know? Just enough to begin. You need to know that Jesus died to redeem you from your sin. You need to know that he commands belief in baptism, and that saves us, Mark 16:16. You need to know that Jesus is the only way to heaven, Acts 4:12, John 14:6. This evening, if you've never taken those steps, we'd encourage you to do that tonight. If you have, but you've wandered away from God for some reason, you need prayers for something in your life, we'd invite you to come. Whatever your need is, we'd ask that you respond as we sing. All things are ready, come to the feast. Come, for the table now is spread.